National Treasury has revealed that South African Airways could still be a burden to the country's economy, despite plans to sell a majority stake in the national carrier. The financially troubled state-owned entity has received 49.7 billion rand in taxpayer money since 2007. To talk more about this, we're joined by independent analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. So, I suppose there's so much for us to unpack, but a good place to start would be, as it stands, who owns SAA?
If you have 51 rand, the answer could be you. And the reality here is that the country today knows nothing about what the ultimate ownership model of SAA is like. And to take you few steps back, last year we were told that after a very lengthy process, the Department of Public Enterprises had eventually concluded that it wanted the Takatso Consortium to become owners of 51% of SAA's stake, and of course the state would retain the 49%. So our understanding at that point in time is that sufficient work had been done behind the scenes to vet the potential bidders and then decide that this was the one bidder that they wanted to promote. Since then, of course, it's been quite surprising just how slow the process has been, because you would have imagined that immediately after that commitment had been made and an amount of 3 billion rand had been mentioned as what was needed to execute the transaction, then the processes would have unfolded in a manner that would enable us to substantively answer that question today of who exactly owns SAA. The fact that none of that has happened simply means that, unfortunately, in spite of the Minister of Public Enterprises and his department's wish that economics are going to follow the politics, the reality here is that it was not going to be a straightforward transaction, simply because whoever wanted to buy SAA, the first question that we all had to deliberate on is whether they would be responsible for the historical liabilities of the airline. And of course, the fact that we are now in this impasse simply means that that answer has not really been determined by the department or the potential bidders, and therefore no one can tell us who exactly owns what at this stage.
Khaya, let's talk about this 51 rand that you mentioned here, because the 3 billion rand, the 3 billion rand that was needed from Takatso as an equity partner, we understand, has still not been paid out. So this amount that has been put before the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, this 51 rand, is that really how much has been, has exchanged hands in this transaction?
I wouldn't use the word much, but I think the reality here is that we have to be able to actually understand the mechanics of how a deal of this nature would work. So essentially, according to the terms of the deal, SAA was essentially worthless at the point in time where the exchange needed to happen. However, in order to facilitate the transfer of a company from one owner to another, you essentially have to pass on the shares. And if you did a basic accounting calculation, you would say, well, if we want to have a 51-49% split, let us assume that there are 100 shares available in this company. So therefore, in order for you to become the legitimate owner of 51 of those shares, you need to pay me 1 rand a share. So it's essentially just a hypothetical number. It's not a reflection of the underlying assets or the liabilities of an entity. It's simply a matter of ensuring that there is indeed an audit trail that supports how you ended up with 51% and I ended up with 49% of a particular transaction. So that's where the issue of 51 rand versus 49 rand comes from. It isn't really a reflection of the underlying value of the business at large.
Let's talk about then the future of this deal currently. You talked about the issue of liabilities and who's going to bear then the historic debt rather of SAA, and what, in the context of this deal, it means for South Africa going forward, because, last year, of course, the impression that again was created is that South Africa had given the last of its bailouts to SAA and that there would be no further money that would be needed, at least not out of the national fiscus, to go towards it.
It's very simple. What we are dealing with here, Kathy, is the problem of an ideological fixation that the ANC government and in particular the Minister of Public Enterprises has with some of the assets that are owned by the state. And why we refer to it as an ideological fixation is that essentially there were two options on the table. There were always two options on the table. The first option is that you liquidate the airline as it was and you simply say to whoever had lent money or had engaged with the airline in the past that, look, this is the end of the road. We've got 10 rand in the bank account and we're going to split it equitably amongst everybody who is owed something. So a liquidation process would have somehow actually put an end to the question of those ongoing liabilities, because the company in its form would have ceased to exist. Unfortunately, the Minister of Public Enterprises does not share that view. He has never shared that view. So the reason they went for the alternative option, which is to say, let us carry on and simply find a buyer, meant that those old liabilities, which could have been killed off, as painful as it would have been for those that are actually owed by SAA, that would have at least enabled everyone to start on a clean slate. And on that clean slate, we wouldn't be now contemplating the question of what the future contingent liabilities are. And unfortunately, because of the minister's ideological fixation, and we must say the paralysis of the cabinet that gave him the go-ahead to pursue this deal clearly without understanding what the implications are, that is essentially how we ended up with this particular crisis. It didn't have to get to this stage.
Khaya, up until this morning or earlier on today, the finance minister and the minister of public enterprises seemed to be at loggerheads over what exactly had been disclosed as a result of this deal. Treasury has consistently maintained it's been kept in the dark. The Auditor General has also come out to say that, no due process was followed. So even policies such as the PFMA were simply disregarded in the processing of this deal. And yet today, it seems that everybody is on the same page.
No, the problem is that we don't know what's on that page. And on that page, the numbers that might be there are only known by the Department of Public Enterprises. The problem, of course, Kathy, is that when you're then seeing these two ministries offering us such completely different interpretations and explanations of what has happened, it is remarkably embarrassing for Cabinet at large, and it is remarkably embarrassing for the President, who has put these individuals in charge of these ministries and said, please go and sort out the state-owned enterprises portfolio. So the fact that there's now this dilly-dallying where National Treasury had been very explicit up until this point that they were absolutely in the dark, and for them to then say, oh, we're withdrawing that notice, that email that it said how exactly in the dark they were, this is simply a matter of them trying to contain the political fallout after the fact has emerged. But the problem here is that it shouldn't matter whether they are at loggerheads or not. It shouldn't matter whether there's been a meeting of the minds. All that we should be looking at is what the merits of the deal are, and we should be able to deliberate on the substance of that rather than being fixated with the question of which personality decides to say what at what point in time, because that is not what you and I are interested in. We simply want to know whether a state entity, whether a state asset has been disposed of, who it's been sold to, and what the merits or otherwise of that deal were, and that's all that we're asking for.
Of course, one of the other big concerning factors, Khaya, is the fact that we have an institution that has simply not been financially accountable. The fact that there are no financial statements for SAA, at least dating back from 2018, is an incredible problem, again, notwithstanding, and not least of which because we've been spending so much money on it.
It's a tricky one because technically the financial statements do exist, but the reason the public cannot see the financial statements is simply the fact that when you prepare financial statements, the standard basis for preparing is that you're saying to people, okay, here's the state of affairs of our company at this point in time. This company will be around in the future, and that's what we refer to as the going concern assumption. Now, for an entity that quite simply cannot prove that it's going to be alive from beyond today, it is not able to prepare financial statements on what you refer to as the going concern, which would simply mean that whoever is responsible for auditing it cannot sign off on those financial statements and say they are a reflection of an entity that will be viable or will be alive beyond today. So in the absence of further state guarantees that then say, okay, if this company needs another 10 rand to operate tomorrow, here's the other 10 rand, then of course the auditors will never be able to sign off those financial statements. And if those financial statements cannot be signed off, then they do not get released into the public arena, and that's why we haven't seen them.
How do we change this situation, Khaya? How do we ensure that it doesn't stay what it has been, and that there is some transparency?
It's very simple. We go back to the question of what we signed up for in 1994. And in 1994, we signed up for an accountability system that should theoretically enable us to say, wait, hold on, a member of the executive has done something in relation to public resources, we need to be able to understand the rationale behind the decision making. In other words, it's Parliament's accountability mechanisms that should be stepping up and asking difficult questions and giving us those answers. If it turns out that those parliamentary accountability mechanisms are not doing their job or they're not fit for purpose, well, that's simply a cost. That's simply a cross that we must bear as taxpayers and as citizens, because we have essentially voted into a system, into law a system that says this is how the accountability is going to be facilitated. And if that's not working out, then it should come back to us as the electorate to figure out how we need to be able to deal with this, because clearly it's an untenable state of affairs.
Independent analyst Khaya Sithole. We'll leave it there for tonight. Thanks for your time.